Hey everybody, I want to give you a heads up. I'm doing another master class on my presentation of lures, and we're in our very tail end of our discussion on presentation by talking about casting. But as I was thinking of concluding my discussion on casting deep structure, I got a phone call from an old friend named Danny Carpenter. I met Danny in Texas when he was living out there. He came to one of my underwater schools. Now, I instantly developed a kinship with this guy. He's kind of like me. Even though I've been fishing for a living for some 35, 40 years, I did it mainly because I love it so much. I love catching fish. And then when I learned the truth about catching fish, the truth about catching a lot of adult-sized fish, and the truth about catching fish in deep water, I couldn't wait to share it with anybody and everybody I ever talked to. So not only did I love fishing, but I love teaching fishing. I have a passion for this sport. There's no two ways about it. And I still have it today. Well, I went fishing yesterday with my kids. I mean, the passion is exactly the same. It's never changed. Well, when I met Danny, he had that same drive, that same passion for the sport. He absolutely loved it. And Danny was a school teacher. And the good news for him was that gave him pretty much a lot of time in the summer he had off. And he lived sort of right on the banks of Sam Rayburn Reservoir down there in East Texas. And I did a lot of work in East Texas. I did a school on Sam Rayburn after I met Danny. But I did one on Tawakoni. I did one on Ray Hubbard. I did one on Texarkana. I mean, I've done a lot of work down in that East Texas. I love that area. A lot of great fisheries. I mean, terrific. I mean, if you're a bass fisherman, that's a good place to live. But at any rate, I got this call from Danny. Hadn't heard from him for quite a while. And he called me up and he said, you know, I'm following your blogs and all of that. And he said, it's just been great. It's like the old days. He said, I know you don't realize it. He said, but what Buck Perry was to you, that's what you've always been to me. And I said, well, I'm about at that age where that doesn't insult me anymore. And he said, no, I'm serious. He said, when I first learned, he said, I read an article that was written. It was actually a 4-part article. Over 4 months it was written about you, and of course included your partner at the time, Tommy. And he said, I believe it was either Fish and Facts or Fins and Feathers magazine. And I said, yeah, I remember those articles. It was written by my old friend Jack Arisman from Peoria. He said, when I first read those articles, I knew that just makes so much sense, it's got to be true. Now Danny, and this is another thing that sort of clued me into this guy was going to end up making a really good fisherman. He, like everybody else in East Texas, had a big old bass boat when he learned some of what you and I have been talking about over the last few months. But it instantly clicked with him, and he had such a desire to catch more and bigger fish. You know what he did? Instantly, he sold his bass boat. Now, I can tell you, in East Texas, that's sort of akin to giving away your firstborn. I mean, it's just, you never hear that. I got an East Texas serious bass fisherman selling his big old bass boat and going to a tiller handle and doing what I suggest that you do. So right away, I took a liking to this guy. I said, man, I got to make sure this guy catches some fish. So that's how we started our sort of friendship, which has lasted now for 25, 30 years. But at any rate, he gave me a call the other day and he said, man, he said, I've been following your blogs. And he said, and here you are talking about sitting down in a casting position. And some of these great examples that you give, you're using some of your old experiences that you had, which made a certain point about casting deep structure. Many of which was sort of circled around and centered around the where to make those casts. And that goes back to Buck's original stuff, where he talked about Why don't you turn around and throw out there? Well, don't have any targets. Well, yes, you do. And I said, so learning where to anchor your boat and where to throw your lures, that comes under the heading of mapping, interpretation, your overall knowledge, and so on and so forth. And he just couldn't get enough of it. He read the book. And when Buck came out with that advanced material, old Danny got involved reading all the advanced material. He studied it. And he just got really good really quick. I mean, again, I think it has a lot to do with his passion. Same passion I have for catching fish. We love it. And he had the time being off in the summer months. And he living on one of the best bass lakes in the country, Sam Rayburn. So in this telephone conversation, he said, I think you forget the first time that you and I went out to Sam Rayburn and went fishing. He said, I don't know how you could leave that out, that story of that particular day, or 3 days as it were. I don't know how you could leave that out of your discussion, he said, so I thought I'd remind you. And then he included some old, I think at the time he had a Polaroid camera. And I just took him fishing. I'll tell you that story, but he took some Polaroid pictures, had these old pictures of that particular day. And then it all came back to me. And again, I said to him, I said, I have to apologize. You know, I've had so many experiences over the years with so many different people. And I said, that one did sort of escape me. And we started talking about it. And I thought, wait a minute now. This is a great day of fishing that will make a couple of points, 2 or 3 points. Most importantly, the importance of a casting position, the importance of interpreting a structure and the knowledge of where to make a cast in deep water, on deep structure. And beyond that, the numbers of fish that were caught. He said, you told me at the time that was the most fish you ever caught from one anchoring position in a day. It was the most fish that you had ever caught. He said, so obviously that's worthy of you telling the story. I said, okay, you're right. And then he sent me these little old Polaroid pictures. I'm going to show you a few of them of that day. But let me tell you what happened. I had done a clinic, and we got to talking. I was talking to this guy now for a couple of years. And he lived in just north of Lufkin. And he fished Sam Rayburn on a regular basis. And he said to me, man, after you do this little show that you're doing here, why don't you stay a couple of days at my house? Take me out, show me how to catch fish out there on Rayburn. He said, that's my home lake. And he said, I really have an interest in the stripers or the hybrid stripers and the white bass. There's a great population out there, they tell me. He said, and I've caught some nice bass in Rayburn, and I'm working at it. He said, but I'd like to get some specific spots and maybe find some areas that would hold some of those white bass and the hybrid stripers. So I ate dinner at Danny's house that night before we went out to the lake. And he showed me a map that he had sent to Buck Perry. He just randomly mailed it to him and said, if you got time, I'd love to have you mark a few spots on my map. And he told him he was a friend of mine, and you know, so and so forth. So Buck wrote on this map. He marked a few spots, made a few comments about seasonal movements and daily movements. And then in real big print, he wrote, big lake, lots of stuff. That really made me laugh, because that's another way of Buck saying, I don't have time to sit down and map your 225,000 acre lake. You know, I'm a pretty busy guy. So he said, I really appreciated that. He said, but he was so right about that. This lake, you can start driving, you go for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. I mean, this is a huge body of water, like so many in Texas are. You know, it's like they always brag in Texas about, you know, everything's big in Texas. Well, their man-made impoundments are big. There's no question about it. So there's a lot of choices of where you're going to go fish. Big lake, lots of stuff. So he said, I'm really confused. I'd really like to find some of these spots that might have the stripers or the hybrids and some of the white bass. And I like to add that to my repertoire, you know. He'd already caught a couple of 9, 10-pound largemouth. You know, he's a good fisherman, don't mistake. But he was sort of new to this mapping and interpretation, where to throw the cast, how to arrive at that spot once you're out there and put it together and interpret that that's the spot where I've got to cast, right there. And I said, okay, I'll tell you what. Let's take your map and let's mark some spots. So when we go out tomorrow, we'll just do a lot of, we'll run around and do a lot of running and see how many spots we can identify. So he broke the map out and he said, I normally put in up here at Jackson Hill. Now it was pretty far up the reservoir. And he said, because I live right here, this is the closest place for me to launch my boat. He said, I'd like to find some stuff up around this area, if it exists. So I looked at the map, I said, yeah, it exists. Big lake, lots of stuff. And there was lots of stuff in that area. We just sat there and talked fishing till midnight at least. But I had marked, and he reminded me, I had marked 17 spots. And we circled these 17 spots we were going to go out and take a look at, physically take a look at the next day. And as I begin my study in a week or so on map and interpretation, I'm going to point out to you that your contour map doesn't give you the spot. It helps put you in an area, but it doesn't give you the exact spot. Hardly ever. At times, it can. And I'll explain that when we get into that study. But I'd circled these spots, and we were going to go out and we were going to confirm that these were productive structures. Now, at Jackson Hill, there's another river that comes in, and when you have a reservoir that big, you have multiple river channels that meet up and intersect and so on and so forth. So you have a lot of side cuts and side feeder streams, a lot of side rivers. So it's not just one river channel where we're looking to find a fish. Danny had specified to me that he was really interested in finding some hybrid stripers and some white bass. So I told him, one of the considerations that you must think about each and every time when you're fishing stripers or hybrid stripers or white bass is that they're not going to be too far from that channel. Now a bass out in Texas, he could be, on that two-sided bar I talked about, he could be 300 yards up a side feeder stream cut and maybe stay there like they did in Tawakoni during that school I told you about. They stayed there for 2 weeks, just dropped into the side cut, back up. But with stripers, hybrid stripers, white bass, I want to have immediate access to a channel. I want to find stuff that has immediate access right now without thinking about it. So as I going out Jackson Hill, going out from the boat ramp, we didn't go a couple of 100 yards, 300 yards, where it opens up into the lake. Right at that corner, I'm going to show you, I pulled it up on Navionics. Right at that corner, I circled that bar right there. And I said, well, let's fish this one first. The one right at the end of that little bay going out there. So we go out there that next morning, and I'm watching my meter, and I follow the brake line around, and I'm expecting to find where that sharper break is. Now, we're not trolling, we're just looking. And it was so gorgeous in real life when I saw it. I said, man, this is even better looking in person than it was on the map. This thing can't miss. And I said, specifically, white bass hybrid stripers, man, this thing's gorgeous. The way that breaks in, and right there, the channel just came right in there and hit that thing before it moved out into the lake. I said, man, this is perfect. Now, as we were loading up, we had launched a boat. While we were loading up, getting ready to go on out there and start looking at these spots, he had a big old 80 quart cooler with him. And he said, I wanted to ask you, in case we catch some fish. He said, I'm having this big cookout in about a week. It was a week or 10 days, something like that. And he said, I'd like to keep, if we get into some of those white bass or hybrids, I'd like to keep some. He said, because I have about 30, 35 people coming to the deal. He said, it'd be great we keep some fish if we catch some. I said, well, we're going to catch some fish. I said, but I thought your main idea here was to do some mapping, interpretation, and learn how I go about finding those spots where we're going to sit down and make a cast. He said, well, I want that too, but just in case we catch some fish. I said, okay, it's fine. I don't care. I said, what's the limit on white bass here on Sam Rayburn? He said, there's no limit on white bass. He said, there is a limit on the stripers or the hybrids, but there's no limit on white bass. I said, no limit? He said, yeah, there's no limit. I think they've changed it. I think it's like 50 now, something like that. At any rate, he said, there's no limit. So I said, okay, great. So we go out there and we hit this first spot. And I see this sharper break, and I thought, this looks better in person than it did on the map. This place looks great. I said, so rather than making a trolling pass, I'm going to spot a couple of markers out here wide of this sharper break, which is about, I don't know, 3 or 4 boats width. It was really breaking sharp. So I threw a couple of markers. It was like casting through a field goal, making a field goal. So when I saw the depths involved, I could anchor. Now, we've been through this over the last few weeks. We could anchor in about 7 or 8 feet of water. It was nice. It was great. Everything was setting up great. So we set up, and I told him put on a 200. And it was either a 200 or a 250. And he couldn't quite remember either, but it was one of the two. I'm thinking it was a 200. But either way, we put on our crankbait. Remember now, we talked about casting deep structure. We only have 2 kinds of baits. We got a jump bait, we got a crankbait. So we're going to fan cast first with the crankbait. Now, one thing about Danny, I didn't have to worry about his mechanical skills. He could cast as good as me, and he was good. And so we put on either the 250 or the 200, and we start our cast. Now, I asked him this on the phone call. He couldn't quite remember, and I couldn't either, because it's been so long, and that day was so fuzzy in so many ways. Some of the details can't quite remember. But if it wasn't the first cast, it certainly was by the 3rd or the 4th cast. Bang, bang. We hit a double at the same time. We just anchored down. We haven't got started yet. 3 or 4 casts at the max, and it could have been the first cast. Can't remember. So I wanted to be honest about that. But our first contact with the fish was almost immediate, and we caught a double. Oh, man, the fish are there. So we started frantically fan casting, and he's thinking about his fish fry now, so he's opening the cooler, and he had ice and everything in there, and he starts tossing these white bass in on the ice, And I don't know how many we caught, 20 or 30, something like that. And it started slowing down. We pretty much had 2 on at a time, nonstop. But then it started slowing down. We made 3 or 4 casts, no fish. And I said, well, we can pick up and leave. You got some fish for your fish fry? I said, we can pick up and leave and go look at some of those other spots. However, since it has that immediate access to the channel, if I was just fishing, I said before I would leave, even though we've caught 20, 25, 30 fish, before I would leave, I'd throw a jump bait. He said, let's throw the jump bait. Like I said, number one with this guy is catching fish, period. Now, he is as hungry to learn as anybody I ever ran into. But he also is hungry to catch fish. He loves catching. So I pulled out, this is what I pulled out right here. I'm going to show it to you. It's a lead head, cost about 2 cents, whatever. Little plastic wiggle tail. And as I recall, we were throwing a 1/4 ounce. Long cast with a jig. We tied on at the same time. We made the cast at about the exact same time. Jump, jump, bang, bang. Double. Whoops, I guess we're not leaving yet. And it went that way for the next hour. We were just catching one fish after the next. It was crazy. After a while, I got tired. Gee whiz, I haven't really even had my coffee yet. I said, man, I got to take a break. I'm tired of catching fish. I never thought I'd ever say that, but I'm a little tired of catching fish. And we had got out there so early, and I've shared with you before, when I go in the morning, I got to have my coffee. And back then, we didn't have these kind of things. We had thermos bottle, So I just sat down, poured me a coffee. I hate to admit it, but back then I smoked cigarettes too. I've been clean 15 years though. It's a horrible habit. If you haven't started, don't. At any rate, he just stood there and kept on casting. I'm sipping coffee. I'm resting a little bit. And he's just standing up there catching fish. And after a while, that slowed down. And I said, well, I didn't think that was ever going to stop. I have no idea how many fish we got in that cooler. But lots. And we had mixed in some good hybrids along with it. Now I'm talking good hybrids. I'm talking 8, 10 pound stuff. And I think a couple of them were even bigger than that. I mean, and then all these white bass. It was a heck of a morning of fishing. I mean, it was great. And I said, well, now that it's finally slowed down, I said, you got a spot right here that we'll never miss. I said, you can come out every day you ever come out. You can bring your wife, you can bring your friends. You'll catch fish here forever. This place is great. I said, so let's go look at some of these other spots. Well, he was still catching fish. It slowed down, but he didn't have to go by 3 or 4 casts. He'd have another fish. And finally he said, well, let's just go ahead and keep fishing this until it really shuts down. And then we'll go look at some of these other spots. I said, okay, that'll work. And I could tell I wasn't going to be able to pull him off of these fish. And after a time, after I finished my coffee, I stood up, started casting again. And folks, those fish never quit. They just didn't quit. And neither did Danny. He didn't quit. He was filling that cooler. And I mean, he was filling it up. So the other day on the phone, I said, you know, mainly because it was white bass. Sure, we had some great hybrids. We had some good fish in there. And I said, and a lot of the white bass were 3 pounds. I mean, this was good fish. I said, but it was still white bass. So I didn't consider like how many consecutive did we catch or any of those things I used to think was important to me. What's my consecutive in bass, largemouth? What's consecutive in smallmouth? What's consecutive in walleye? I did all of that, but I never did in white bass. And I said, I can't remember how many fish we caught, but I know it was a bunch. And one of the reasons I knew it was a bunch is because he informed me that back at where we had launched, back at the boat dock, they have a fish cleaning station. And he had planned on cleaning these fish. And more importantly, he planned on me helping him. I said, man, how many fish are in there? And he said, I have no idea. And I think it took us about 2 hours. We were cleaning fish for 2 hours. But make this long story short, I said to him on the phone, I said, I'll tell you, when I reflect back on it, I said, I know we caught at least 80 fish before we picked that anchor up. 80 fish, folks. Listen to me now. This isn't Don Dickson trying to brag about how many fish we caught. This is just map and interpretation, throw a lure. I threw 2 lures. 2 lures. That was it. 1 anchor position, 2 baits. We didn't have to go through all of these who's got the latest, greatest bait or any of that nonsense. We threw the basic crankbait and we threw a jig that cost 2 cents and sat there for 4 or 5 hours doing nothing but catching fish. Same anchoring position, never picked it up. He wasn't going to leave those fish. He wanted to learn about the rest of the lake, but he didn't want to leave those fish. I'm showing you some pictures of these fish just to let you know this is not a joke. But to me, it was like, it's almost automatic. And I told him, you can come here for the next 10 years, you'll be catching fish off this spot. We don't have to catch every one of them today. But I sort of agreed with him. If somebody would have told me there's 3,000, 4,000 fish in that school, I would have believed it. I mean, I don't know how many fish were down there. It was crazy. We caught fish from the time we dropped that anchor till the time we left. We had to leave so we could have 2-3 hours to clean all these fish. But I said to him, I said, I know for sure in my mind we caught at least 80 fish. He said, well, I know you're right about that, he said, but it was considerably north of 80 fish. I said, I started laughing, and then I started thinking after this phone call. He's right. That was the most fish. Forget species. That was the most fish I ever was involved with catching from one anchoring position without picking that anchor up. Now, it was like they moved and then it slowed down a little bit and they moved again, slowed down a little bit. I'd never seen anything quite like that. But clearly that spot, the spot that we knew before we went out there, the spot that we circled and said, that's our first spot, that's a can't miss. Not only didn't it miss, somewhere between 80 and 100 fish we carried in that cooler for his fish fry. And we spent 2-3 hours cleaning them. I'll never forget that. I got tired of doing that too. I don't mind admitting it. I told him that's one part of that day I wish I could forget. It wasn't easy. So at any rate, that was our first day on Sam Rayburn. Now, he wasn't going to let me go home the next day. I was planning one day to show him 17 structures that I would circle and go fish and why I would fish it and so on and so forth. And how I would fish it. But we had only fished one structure. and he said, you can't leave. You got to give me one more day. Well, I was always self-employed since I got into fishing business, so I could pretty much do what I wanted. But I did have some upcoming work, but I said I couldn't turn them down. I said, okay, we'll go out tomorrow. I said, but we can fish it a little bit, but we got to go see these spots so that you're learning some lessons. He said, yeah, that's what I want. That's it. Okay. So the next day we go out past our spot. I said, we're not stopping. I said, we don't have to. We know how good that spot is. I said, but up to the right of Jackson Hill, there was an underwater railroad grade, a train trestle. And it showed it very clearly on a map. Here, I'm going to show it to you here on my Navionics. It's there. And I said to him, now keep in mind, this road bed, what looks like, for all intent and purposes, is like a road bed. Same thing, railroad grade road bed. We talked about it before in our structure types, man-made reservoirs. Where that old bridge was blown out and where it drops into that channel, I said, another perfect spot because it just breaks straight off into that channel. Perfect spot. Looking for white bass and hybrids. Good spot for anything, but certainly for that species. So he said, okay. I circled that one, and then we had, on the other side of the lake, we had more what I would consider more bass spots to go look at. But I said, first let's go up and check this underwater railroad grade, because these structures have been so good to me in the past. I said, this is automatic, and it's real close to where we fished yesterday. It's, right out from your ramp. Let's go look at it. We went over and looked at it, and I said, okay, let's just to verify this thing, let's make a couple trolling passes. As I recall, it was breaking into the channel around 17 feet. Now, we're pretty far up the reservoir, breaking about 17 feet, but a lot of depth in the channel. We had plenty of water. So I said, let's make a couple of trolling passes, hit the end of this thing, see if there's any fish there, see if we can verify this before we move across the lake. First pass, first or second pass, one pass, reverse around, I think, bang, bang, 2 fish. Hybrid stripers. Oh. Now, what do you think the chances are that I got him to leave that spot at that time? I couldn't. He said, let's at least check it out a little bit further. I said, okay. So I think we caught 25 fish, and it didn't take very long. And he sent me this picture. He said, I want to prove it to you that second day. He said, we hit that railroad trestle, and he said we caught this handful of fish, and I took a Polaroid of you. Here it is. So he said, and then you forced me to leave. We're going to go do some mapping, which we did. But he kept those fish for the fish fry. So okay with me. But I said, when we left there, I said, brother, you've got 2 spots. When you launch your boat, you're not 10 minutes away from catching a jillion fish. You can just live on those 2 spots, and nobody's going to be bothering you. You know that. Ain't nobody fishing that stuff. You can own those spots. So I'd fall in love with those spots if you want to catch, especially catching these species that we've already confirmed are using these two structures. He said, okay, great. And then we went and we looked at the other 15 structures. So now the first two that we picked out, not only did they produce, but produced like crazy. And then we started looking at the more bassy kind of stuff on the other side of the lake. We went back down the lake a little ways, but a lot of great looking structure. And we fished a little bit at each structure to confirm. I knew that they were all good just looking at them. But I wanted it to be confirmed in his mind so that he would continue to fish these spots. And at the same time, by fishing these spots, you could tell if there's any standing timber left on these bars or something, that makes it difficult to fish. Then you sort of write it off and find the cleaner stuff. So, at any rate, we went to these other 15 structures. And 13 of those 15 structures we caught fish that day. 2 of them we didn't. It was later in the day. And I'm convinced it was simply because there was no movement or activity, where there was some activity on these other bars, other structures. So out of the 17 that we drew on the map, 15 of them produced fish in the 2 days that we fished. But the one day we fished, we only fished 1 structure. So the second day we fished 16 structures and caught fish on every one but 2 of those structures. So I thought by sharing that with you, I could at least impress upon you the importance of our next area of study, which is mapping and interpretation. If you know where to throw that cast in deep water, on deep structure, you'll catch fish nearly every time you go fishing. I used to tell people I catch fish every time I go fishing, period. And if I ever miss a day, I'm the most surprised person in the world. But I do know that all the movement and activity of fish is controlled by weather and water conditions. So you're going to run into some tough conditions. But if you're always doing the right thing at the right time in the right place, you're pretty much going to catch fish every time you go fishing. So at any rate, Danny was very appreciative of me spending those couple days with him. We found out an awful lot about his lake. And I said to him, as we were finishing up this phone call, I said, Danny, I know you went out and fished those spots and you fished that lake pretty near every day. I said, did those structures remain good, didn't they? He said, Don, it was unbelievable. He said, I can't even begin to tell you how many fish that I've caught off of the railroad trestle and that first bar. But there are fish like that in your lake too. I'm telling you now, they are. And starting next week, when we get into this area of mapping and interpretation, I'm going to show you exactly how you can pinpoint those spots. So that's what I'm going to be teaching. I hope you'll be with me. Follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe. We've had a little rush on those subscriptions lately, and I really appreciate it. So if you got some friends, share it with them that we're all having a good time and we're learning a little something. So invite them to join us, and I appreciate having you here today, and we'll see you the next time.